Welcome to the show, everybody. We are super excited to have on today Colin Cantrell, the man behind Nexus. The man, the myth, the legend. Welcome.
Thank you for having me on the show, buddy.
Absolute pleasure, absolute pleasure. Now, I always like to start off for anybody who might not have researched Nexus a lot or might not know a lot about it. Can you just give us the quick elevator pitch? What is Nexus?
I guess I just usually start with Nexus means a connection between two or more things. So it's kind of a movement. We're kind of creating a positive culture around it. It's a cryptocurrency. It's a distributed satellite network eventually. So, I just usually can say it's a set of tools that will allow us to kind of better our life and improve our future, basically.
Awesome. Good way to put it. Fantastic. Now, I did a review on Nexus a while ago, and there's so many things that are really impressive with what you guys are developing. The 571-bit key, for example, is a great idea. And so that, I guess, leads me to one of the first topics I want to discuss, which is quantum resistance. Can you explain why that is important for blockchains to have this sort of forward-thinking quantum resistance, and why is it actually a danger?
Well, so it's, I guess on the forward thinking or the danger, I guess I could start there. The danger is there's an algorithm called Shor's algorithm. So it was developed in, I believe, 1994 by Peter Shor. And what it basically figured out is that you can factor really large numbers. So there's the integer factorization problem very, very quickly. So what that means in terms of encryption is RSA is completely useless. Anything can be reversed. You can decrypt communications because you have a public key which allows you to encrypt, and then your private key is what allows you to decrypt. So in the same form, a signature is the opposite, where you basically encrypt with your private key and you decrypt with your public key so that you can verify a certain amount of data was created by a certain owner and prove ownership that way. So getting onto the second part of it, there's elliptic curve cryptography, which is what we utilize and what Bitcoin utilizes. Bitcoin uses a 256-bit curve. We use a 571-bit curve, but essentially what happens is you're able to reverse the private key from the public key. So what that means to the end user is you could have coins in an address and somebody with a quantum computer can reverse that and find your private key and then spend. So that creates a big significant security risk when any public key is vulnerable because anybody can essentially steal your money, and that renders kind of the security of it null. And it doesn't matter if you have the strongest proof of work, somebody essentially could do the same thing of stealing your funds without even having to hack your computer. So when it comes into why is it significant and why is it good to be forward thinking, I've seen a lot of arguments for and against it. Oh, well, we can adapt when quantum computers become a threat, but the problem is every address prior to adapting is vulnerable. Even some of Satoshi's original keys back in the day before they did pay to script or pay to public key hash, which is kind of what they use now, it was actually just pay to public key on some of the early versions. So, all of those original blocks Satoshi Nakamoto mined are vulnerable, which means somebody can unlock those coins and access them. And that's millions of, Bitcoin as far as we understand. The other big problem is that you're going to have a swarm of transactions because in order to upgrade your keys, you're going to have a new transaction type or a new signature type. And so you're going to have this massive upgrade that's, even showing difficult for Blockstream to update the block size, for whatever reasons we want to say. So Bitcoin even expressing difficulties in upgrading a simple line of code, which the block size would be, upgrading to more quantum secure is another big problem. And then the second way that quantum computers affect is what's called Grover's algorithm. So, everybody knows, I think I'll just explain a quantum computer can be a 0 and a 1 at the same time because the qubit can exist in a state of superposition, right? So with that being on the Grover side of things, you actually reduce the hash security by 2. So Bitcoin's proof of work algorithm would actually be reduced to 128-bit quantum secure, and SHA-256, SHA-256, SHA-2 as we use now was developed in 2001 by the NSA. So upgrading the hashing, that's what fuels every transaction. That's where the proof of work comes from. And that's where a lot of coins, even when they upgrade their hashing algorithm, let's say on the proof of work side, I've still seen remnants of a lot of SHA-256 on the transaction hashing, and they use RIPE MD162 for the address hash. So with that being, it makes it a lot more plausible for a quantum computer to attack and brute force these. So you basically want to double your security length on hashes. And then with the cryptography or the asymmetric, which is where you have your public and private keys, you want to find some solution that's either quantum secure where they can't reverse it, whether looking in a hash-based cryptography or new kind of post-quantum algorithms coming out, which are, lattice-based is looking really promising. But I mean, with cryptography, you have to have years and years of crypto analysis in order to really render something secure, because it's game theory. You have to attack it from every way possible in order to determine that it's secure. Just because you believe it being secure doesn't mean it will be. So NIST is having another post-quantum algorithm competition. So when you double the key size, it actually multiplies the required qubits, and the number of qubits right now are relatively small. I think they're, maybe 1,000, if that. Now, Bitcoin keys can be cracked with 1,792 qubits in polynomial time, which just means it goes from 2 to the 256 is what it would be in exponential time to 2 cubed. So that's how big of a difference it is. That's astronomical decreases. It goes from billions of years to 100 years or 10 years even. So eventually quantum computers can get to the point where they can crack these keys like this. And if we're not prepared and thinking forward about that, then we're going to have a lot of issues. And I think, that's a very significant attack vector on the protocol itself. If there's any adversarial forces that may not want Bitcoin to succeed, there's,
and there's a lot of them. Bitcoin's under attack constantly.
Yeah. And if you destroy public confidence, that's going to be a big problem. And even another thing, too, is 256-bit keys. There's something called the Large Bitcoin Collider, if you've ever heard of it.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, they're making millions and millions and millions of private keys trying to find it. And they found, I think, 20 or 30 keys that they don't really have Bitcoins in it, but that were actually Bitcoin addresses at one point. So being that they're even able to brute force 256, we need a larger key space, right? So with the larger keys, we require around like 3,500 qubits to crack, and it gives it a little bit longer time. And then the second thing, that's where we get into signature chains. So with the signature chain, I think the most bulletproof way to do it is you have a key only used once, and once that key is revealed, you dispose of it. And that's kind of how a lot of top secret is done. You only use one key once. A lot of people want it to be stateless, which means that you can keep using it over and over again. But classically, you can still kind of reduce the security of a 256 just with side channel attacks. Over 200 signatures, people have been able to attack Bitcoin keys. So using a key more than once, I think, is something that isn't going to be the most secure. So that's where a lot of the power of signature chains comes in, is you hash your public key, you assign that, and you don't reveal your public key until your next transaction, and you create a chain, kind of like your own personal blockchain, that your username and password over here creates this hash, and then you have a pin and a bunch of, whatever deterministic number on it that creates this hash, concatenate them together and create a 512-bit hash, which then you load in as a new private key, make the public key, hash that public key, bam, you got a next hash. Your next transaction, you do the same thing, but you create a whole new key set. So that's it's kind of a double-edged thing that makes it, beneficial to people. For one, it's simple to understand. You don't have to keep wallet backups. You can generate your keys just from client side and then say, hey, I can sign this transaction, make offline transactions without even having to talk to a network or keep backups. And it kind of feels similar to, I guess, logging into your bank account, which I think is going to be something that people are going to need in order to move forward. They need that cohesive, oh, hey, well, what's this Bitcoin stuff? What are these addresses? Oh, what's this? And the simpler we can make it, the better. So that allows you to kind of have a username, password, PIN number. Every time you make a transaction, you have to put your PIN. And then that's the safest place to keep your Bitcoins or your Nexus in your head. Because
because it's the only place it can't be hacked yet, anyway.
And then it can be proved if you haven't or not. There's, so many implications of it. So that's where signature chains kind of builds a power, and that also builds a trust too. So that's how you can kind of link and have your reputation on the network. Now, somebody doesn't have to know if that's you or not, but that allows you to build up this kind of public reputation that other people can see by contributing your time and showing that you haven't tried double spend attacks, or you've been logging transactions properly, you've been producing good blocks. And that's kind of like a secondary weighting system that builds up over time, so that you can't just Sybil attack with computing power. You can't just Sybil attack with, a lot of nodes, because it takes an immense amount of time to overcome that. And then you really have to go back in time in order to beat the other people that already have time contribution. So it's kind of a way that once you get to a certain point, it's very, very, very difficult to attack the network.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting stuff. I think it's a problem that a lot of people don't understand very well, and I think that gives a lot of really good information, from great. I love it. especially when you consider how difficult it is for like the Bitcoin community to agree on anything. I worry that when this does become a problem, that they won't have been forward thinking enough and they won't be able to react quick enough to actually be able to solve it when it does happen. So, better to, be prepared for these kind of things. Now, the next thing I want to move on to, and this is one thing that gets people, I think, really excited about Nexus. You guys are going to put satellites in space. That's super exciting. Your dad runs a a rocket company, right? So tell us a bit about that connection and why are you guys putting satellites in space and how is that going to be beneficial to the Nexus blockchain?
Okay, so it's going to be beneficial because it reduces censorship and it allows us to have access anywhere, and it opens up a whole new world for people. And it also gets rid of some of the abilities to have things constantly tracked and controlled. Like, I mean, all the packets going through the cables on the internet are pretty much watched. And of course, that's why quantum computers are something the NSA has been working on. But the really big thing about it is creating that global coverage and creating the ability for people to access that. And I mean, satellites and mesh networks on the ground can work together in one to allow us to distribute the internet, to make it something that can't be taken down. And also 60 kilometers up is international space. Mm-hmm. So once you get up that high, there's no law. There's just complete sovereign international territory, similar to kind of international waters. So it really opens our doors to remove these censorships and kind of create a more robust system on the hardware levels. And so the way this relationship kind of evolved, it's kind of funny. When I was about 15 years old, I worked for John Garvey, who was doing Garvey Spacecraft Corporation, because Elon Musk came to my father to start SpaceX, and my dad brought Garvey in and everything. And after a while, Garvey was just like, no, microsats are the way to do it. And Elon's like, no, I'm going to make big rockets. So Garv went and started Garvey Spacecraft Corporation in his garage, just building small rockets.
As you do.
And, right. And over like 10 or 15 years, it evolved. And so, I mean, I was actually helping build some of the original rocket engines back in the day. I remember their injector. Now they do a 3D printed injector. I was actually helping them with a 2-part injector, which didn't work as well because we lost our engine one time. So over the course of time, I mean, Garv and my dad eventually just kind of got together and said, hey, let's start Vector. And my dad took the CEO position. Garv took the CTO, COO. And they just came up with all these great ideas and grand ideas, because the small sat industry back in those days wasn't as large. But as computing power has gotten better, as we've gotten better at producing these things, the bottleneck on cube satellites now is the launch, because it used to take long enough to build one that the launch time didn't really matter. They could piggyback on a big rocket. But now there's going to be a higher and higher frequency of these things. And I kind of almost call them like the personal computer was for space, what Apple did for people with personal computing. I mean, we can have space-based computing. We can do our own image mapping. We can have our own relays. We can have our own communication grids, and kind of put that power into us. Hey, people want to see if the world's flat. Well, why don't you just look at a satellite? Put up a satellite. We can put an end to this debate and not have to go on steam-powered rockets. So it really opens the doors, and it's a new frontier. And I mean, the combination of a cryptocurrency and space I think those are very powerful allies. I think that artificial intelligence, blockchain, and space are the 3 industries of the future that are going to be exponentially growing over the next 5 or 10 years. So getting in on the ground floor of them is going to just show an increasingly widening market, which is going to make an incredible change and impact upon the world.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Your dad must be very proud of you, He goes and makes a rocket company. You're like, you know what, Dad? That's boring. I'm going to make the new internet and, advanced digital currency. That's fantastic. I love it. I love that there's actually that convergence where you can both come together and, you can put cube satellites in there. Your dad puts them up in space. I think that's absolutely awesome.
It kind of came together, and serendipitous, I guess you can say. We just were talking one day like, hey, I was like, I've been really wanting to build this satellite network for a long time. And he's like, well, I just started this rocket company. Like, let's put satellites up. And I'm like, all right. I mean, we kind of did our own things, and now it's unfolded this way. So
that's awesome. Pretty cool. That's awesome. That's really, really cool. Now, the 3D blockchain is something that I think gets a lot of people excited. And, I listened to your presentation in Aspen, and it was really interesting, and I've read some of the breakdowns on that. I got 2 questions here for you. One, explain it to a 5-year-old, the most simple terms. What is the 3D blockchain going to be for anybody who kind of isn't, sort of up on tech, and then give us the full breakdown of what that's going to look like, with all the fun technical details that we want to hear.
I guess the simple analogy that I try to use is Bitcoin is like a bunch of giant freight ships having to link together and carry this freight to every city in the world. The 3D blockchain is kind of like being able to shoot the letters into their own corresponding location in boxes and have multiple people verify those boxes and make sure they get to their destination and send it to the place that it needs to go. Instead of having to be in one giant package, it can be done in parallel.
Very cool. Very cool. So why is this important? I mean, I look at what's going on with Bitcoin and, they're going to bring in the Lightning Network at some point to try and do the off-chain scaling solution. Obviously, Ethereum's working on Raiden. Does this solve the scaling issue, but on-chain?
Yeah, basically that's the kind of premise of it is we need to have microtransactions. I mean, right now it costs $15, $20 to send a Bitcoin because the size is so big. And Bitcoin is, I mean, for a little more technical, it's a glorified linked list, which means a linked list is basically you have a node and you have a little piece of data in that node and then it links forward and backward in a list, right? And it's something that you learn in entry-level computer science, and that's kind of what Bitcoin is. But the capacity of these blocks this way is what limits your throughput. So I mean, as far as I understand, the Plasma, or they named it Raiden now, something with Ethereum, they're kind of doing a similar thing that they're making side chains and side chains and side chains, but you're going to have to move through each layer to get back in. So it's a little bit better than Lightning, which is basically, hey, we're taking everything off here and you have to deal with this payment processor. Now, I think the Lightning Network is a bit of a problem on the on-chain or off-chain scaling front because that opens up for banks to come in and start becoming the Lightning nodes and the censored nodes, and then governments come in and say, oh yeah, well, we're going to freeze this payment channel. Like, I think this is a problem. And it turns kind of and degrades into kind of a Ripple type thing again. And so with the 3D blockchain, I mean, it's very important for us to be able to have full cryptographic scaling and also multiple levels of locking, multiple resource inputs into the consensus so that it's not just one person that can control it all. So when there's the 3 levels, it allows you different, I guess you can say, rates of security. So, I mean, the lower levels like L1s will process a lot faster, but they could be reorganized a little bit more depending on how everything happens on the L2 level. So you'd want to buy bubble gum with this, or you'd buy simple electronics, $100 purchases. On the L2s, it'd be like for buying a car. And the L3s, it would be like you're buying a house or you're sending $1 million. So it allows kind of a gradient of the weight and the validity of that data, but it also takes into account another very important part, which is trust. Now, I mean, if let's just say theoretically Bitcoin had a trust mechanism in their mining, and let's say if there's a certain amount of witnesses of transactions in the memory pool and somebody releases an empty block like Antpool does, and if that would reduce their trust and their trust influenced their reward, then they'd have an incentive to be honest. They'd have an incentive to actually make blocks and process everything. And then they'd have more incentives to increase block sizes and scale it a little bit more. So I mean, the trust system is something that I think is very important. In a trustless system, we need mathematics to be the trusting entity, not just, oh, I say this and you say that. I mean, the thing that makes Bitcoin so beautiful is that you can validate it. Everybody can validate it. Everybody can validate it externally. I can say, well, you say that this transaction happened. I can go and I can verify the cryptography and make sure that this specific instance happened, that you're not altering the data, that you're not sending me bad transactions, that you're not sending me false signatures. And the same thing can be with a distributed trust system, where the amount of trust you build up is something that corresponds to your track record, and you can be influenced negatively or positively with that, and you can verify that so you can know what nodes to talk to mathematically, not what nodes Blockstream says to talk to, or what nodes Antpool says to talk to, or Bitmain. And so it gives more people the opportunity to contribute to the network, and also kind of create a time value from, because we say not everybody has money, but everybody has time. And in essence, time is one of the most valuable resources we all have. And the richer the rich are, I mean, they just have more and more money because they have more and more people spending their time for them. But what if it was something that they were required to do? What if they have to actually expend their time? It's going to be a very expensive cost of an attack. So combining that, that's where the trust side comes in on the y-axis. And then the weight side comes in from the consensus. How many people agree on this happening? How much work has been done on that data? And that kind of sinks it further. And then the width of that tells you basically how secure that data is, how sunken in it is, similar to like a confirmation would be on Bitcoin.
Very, very interesting. The next thing I wanted to move on to was smart contracts. What is the Nexus solution to addressing kind of smart contracts and bringing that to your blockchain?
We're calling them advanced contracts. So, I mean, I don't want to reveal too much about this because there's a lot of copycatters in there, and I'll get to that when I read the white paper. But a lot of the contracting engines right now are based on a remedial architecture. It's basically a virtual machine. They're all stack-based, which means it's done on a stack. Bitcoin even has a basic one of those. And all the processing has to be done, like Ethereum, for instance. They have to process every time a transaction comes in and include the new state of all these variables. So what we're working on is kind of a more distributed virtual machine where your contracts build up into a larger code library, and you can kind of read and write from each other and work with each other like they're each pieces of an actual virtual computer. And then with the L1, L2, and L3 locks, miners can be doing some of the more intensive work and proving that they did work on that contract and use that as another proof of work, right? You can actually utilize that computing power, and other than just locking the data in, like with the one hash rules all, we can do computation, and same with the L2 locks. And the L1s can just verify balances and do just very simple things. ECDSA, which is just verify signatures. So basically we're working on making it a scalable contract solution, and also kind of the way I think a distributed computing system should work is where all of the nodes together create one giant computer, and you can basically buy a piece of space off of it and use this pieces of this computer so that you can have a fully distributed computational environment.
Very, very interesting. Now, what are the next milestones moving forward for you guys? You know, what are you looking for kind of getting out next, basically?
So I broke the 3DC, or the three-dimensional chain, into a series of 3 updates because we want to unlock it piece by piece. We don't want to just throw this giant amalgamation of code out there and expect it to work perfect. So there's going to be the L1, L2, and L3 locks, like I was describing earlier. That's going to come as Tritium, Amine, and Obsidian. So I call that the Tau framework, which is going to basically be unlocking the contracting levels too at the same time. So the advanced contracts in tune with the 3-dimensional chain, and then of course building up the mesh networks and building up the satellite constellation and working with other people, and also constant collaboration, finding other people, finding use cases, figuring out how to streamline it with the actual industries. We've been talking to some people that have payment processing, experience, basically where they actually built point of sale systems with Bluetooth beacons and things like that. So, streamlining it for the user experience and then making it capable of the full user experience. So the milestones would be the Tau, it would be constant, collaboration or collaborative outreach, and the satellites and mesh networks.
Fantastic. And so Tritium, of course, is going to be the first. That's the layer 1, right? So that's going to be basically simple transactions and things like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's going to be the transactional level locks and the beginning of some multi-processing of these transactions, and utilizing still kind of the old blockchain architecture to unlock it. Now, the L2 is going to take the NPOS, which is the Nexus proof of stake, and add that into the second level of locks. They're going to be basically locking all of these buckets together. And then the L3, or Obsidian, is going to be the distributed pool, where you're going to be able to submit the shares into it so that we reduce mining pools. And there's also a constant contribution. So it would be almost like you mining on the mining pool, you would get constant credit from the network instead of it being only if you guys are lucky to win. Because having a winner, one lucky person, is kind of a way that it can be a little bit centralized when, every Bitcoin block comes, let's say, every 10 minutes. There's only one miner that's getting credit for that. The whole global hash rate is not contributing to the security, and I think that's something that should be contributed. So that's where the Obsidian levels come. And then the advanced contracts are going to be implemented through each one of the layers and expanded on each layer.
Fantastic. Now, what about transaction fees with Nexus?
So we're going to be moving towards free transactions. So the way you mitigate that is a simple type of IOTA style where you'd be required to verify signatures of a couple before you. So the more transactions you put out, the more you help the L1s, but that would be kind of your cost. And then the other type of L1 lockers would be ones that earn Nexus on it. So getting rid of transaction fees is, I think, something that needs to happen. I think the network itself, just by miners mining and earning Nexus and the slight inflation that comes from it already, is something that should pay for it. We shouldn't add the fees on top of it, because transaction fees for Bitcoin were based around needing a way to prevent spam attacks, right? So you prevent spam attacks by just requiring you to do a little bit of work. Or you say you got one transaction a minute you can send from your SIG chain, and if you send 2 per minute, then you got to, help somebody else. Or, you can scale it in that way so that you just require a little bit of work. And the second one is that Bitcoin's deflationary inherently, which means as the supply of Bitcoin continues to go down, the actual new supply coming out, we're looking at a problem of transaction fees being the only thing to support the mining network, which could create a deflationary collapse. Miners could jump ship and go to Bcash. I mean, and the chain could get locked. I mean, it could create a lot of really, really serious issues as it goes further. So I believe just a very, very slight inflation is something that is going to be the best way for it to happen. A complete deflationary system, it just creates a hoarding type environment. And I mean, yes, it does increase the valuation high as a speculative instrument, but as a currency instrument, it's not really the best. So that's why, I mean, Bitcoin's probably going to become more a commodity like gold, and we're a currency. You know, we're meant to transact, to transfer value and keep it flowing. And so that's, you know, if you want to hold it too, you can earn it by staking as well. So, I mean, that's basically my perspective on the whole transactional fee environment and why we're deciding to go to zero fees.
I like it. I like it. And that's, I'm glad you answered. My next question was going to be how you guys can prevent spam attacks, but you already answered that. Now, I think it's really interesting too that so many people look at the word inflation as simply a dirty word, and it's not necessarily. The inflation that you see with like the US dollar, well, that's kind of dirty because they just print money when they want it. It's not anything planned. It's not like we're going to, you know, have reasonable supplies and money increase. Like, we need an extra $100 billion. Let's print it. You know, and that's problematic.
Print.
Exactly.
That's inflation.
And so how much inflation does Nexus have?
Well, so we have a variable interest rate. So it's 0.5% to 3% variable interest on Nexus Proof of Stake, which I developed that in about 2015. So after 2 years of Nexus Proof of Stake being active, the annual inflation rate is 0.7%, which is extremely low. So that's something, I mean, I believe that inflation can bring a new value into the industry, and it creates a whole industry around the new supply coming in. And as long as it's something that's mathematically regulated, not by some central authority that can just keep printing, like, I mean, they're doubling our money supply like almost every year these days. And prices are going up like astronomically, but if it's a constant rate that people can regulate and see, I think it's something that's going to be a lot more beneficial. And then making the interest rate variable like we have, where it just moves up on an LN curve, kind of like this, what happens is it gives, for one, somebody incentive to continue to hold, and it also reduces the inflation from the people that don't really secure the network too much. So it kind of creates a balanced correspondence with what you contribute is what you get back. And I think that's how it should be.
That's really cool. You know, it incentivizes people, of course, to be staking, and it, you know, mathematical equations like this are so important because, like you said, if you leave it to a central authority, even if you start something with the best of intentions, over time it will become corrupted. It's simply the cycle of, you know, human governance, you know. But if you prevent them from doing that by writing in, you know, the equation at the start, they can't do it.
Exactly.
That's it. Fantastic. Now, moving forward, you know, what are the sort of the challenges that you see to actually get this all taking off?
Well, the challenges are basically developmental speed, finding the right people. That's a big challenge because, I mean, we're on the forefront of developing a new architecture beyond just anything that's been seen before with a three-dimensional chain. So getting the right people, that's a big challenge. And I'd say another challenge is just dealing with market conditions sometimes where there's, you know, it's just crypto and, I mean, everything's moving and the volatility sometimes. So, I mean, but I've found the best way to circumvent that or to improve on that is just to produce value and not let things get you down. So, and then the next one, the satellite constellation is going to be extremely challenging too. I mean, Vector is doing Galactic Sky, which is basically a distributed mesh network virtual machine in space. And they have Citrix with ZenOS partnered with them, helping them develop this. But I mean, the challenge on our side too is because we're not just relying on Galactic Sky, we're actually figuring out how to make a decentralized satellite network. And that's a huge challenge too, because I mean, right now you basically have to have a control center, or you have to have a command and control, or you have to have operations managers. You have to satellites don't fall out of orbit. And how do we turn these satellites into something people can buy? How do we help people be able to manage them themselves? How do we get the proper frequencies chosen so that we don't have as much impact on the FCC? How do we overcome some of these competitions? And how do we make it truly decentralized? Where, I mean, in essence, it would be like decentralized server clusters where you can buy a server. You can have a server in your house. You can connect directly with your satellite. how do we make that done right and not just skimp it and rent a satellite or just rely completely on Galactic Sky? Like, how do we combine these together? So Galactic Sky is definitely a good first step, and it's a more distributed approach, especially since we have a very solid collaboration with them. But truly making the internet decentralized, I think, is the biggest challenge of all, because these answers aren't complete yet. And I mean, anybody that says they figured it out just now, like, they're lying to themselves. It takes years and years of studying something and building and developing something to truly figure it out. Just like the way the three-dimensional chain came, that's a culmination of 3 years of thinking, game theory, figuring out how do we do this? How do we scale? And that's kind of how it kind of came fully formed. And that's why I presented it at the conference, is figuring that. And I mean, it just took that long to, how should I say it, to come to full fruition, into a time where I felt, okay, this is right now. So, I mean, it's always a challenge to be developing new technology. So, I mean, all in all, wrapping that whole thing, that is a big challenge, being at the forefront of something that's never been done before, because you don't know how to do it yet. And there's no references for it. You can't go to somebody and say, well, hey, how do I build this linked list? Or, now you can go and say, oh yeah, how do I build a blockchain? It's easy now. Like back in the 2013 days, there was no tutorials how to figure out Bitcoin. Like the only where to go was the code and learn from what Satoshi did, So, I mean, I think that's the biggest challenge, is doing things that have never been done before. And also just I guess, moving through the struggle and never, ever, ever, ever giving up, and keeping our eye on what we're doing and overcoming these things to make it a reality. And even overcoming the opposition of others that say, oh, this is grand, you're not going to be able to do it. Well, we can, and we will, because we do what we say we're going to do. I mean, we don't say we're going to do it before we do it. We say we're doing it because we're doing it. Mm-hmm. So it's, I guess you can say it's a little different, almost like Satoshi in some days, where, oh, this isn't ever going to work. But, I mean, overcoming that and continuing that, I think, is something that really has a reward beyond measure, just knowing that you can do it, especially knowing that we can provide that for people and see the world becoming a better place.
And Colin, that's what separates people, believing or not believing. And yeah, I can tell you believe, and that's amazing. And I think that makes people believe in the Nexus project. And, simply having that just singular focus of, this is just going to happen. This is what we're doing. This is where we're pushing. This is how we're going to make it happen. And it's going to take time, but it's going to happen. And that's amazing. That's the exact kind of, headspace you have to be in to pull this off. And you're there, and that's awesome. One final question for you. Who are the people that you need? What kind of places do you still need to fill in? And I guess on from that, how can people get involved in the Nexus community?
Okay, so I mean, there's always a need for more people, because that's what makes a powerful movement. So I mean, at the core of it, I mean, any really sophisticated C++ coders that can think out of the box and come in, I mean, that's something that we're always in need of to improve our developmental speed, because like I said, it's finding the right people. But I mean, more people that believe in the vision of, like, a positive culture and making the world a better place too. More people to come out of this greed mentality and see, like, cryptocurrencies really have a light we can bring in the world, and we can really reform a lot of the monetary systems. But if we allow it to become corrupted by our own desire to make more and more money or get a crypto Lamborghini or anything, that's going to slow the process down. So, like, I mean, we need people to see the bigger picture here of, are we going to create another banking system, or are we going to create a better system? And I'm always going to be forging to create a more positive future, and to create a positive cultural movement with humanity in mind, where you balance the one, which is you, and the oneness, which is all of us, and people recognizing that. But to get involved, I guess you can say, we have the Slack channel. We're creating what are called pods. So I don't know if we went into that, but it's kind of social architecture. So John David Garcia, back, I think for 20 years, did a lot of research on what is the most creative combination of people. Because you notice big groups does not work. One person is creative as 2 people. And so what he found out is that 8 people together in one group actually were the most creative combination of people. So we've been basically creating pods where we'll say, hey, do you want to take a lead on this pod? And people go in and take a lead, and they'll lead 8 people or 7 other people and pursue a project. Like, We have one for collaborative outreach. We have one for content. We have one for editing. We have one for coders. We have one for exchange outreach. I mean, all these different pods that will allow people to organize themselves and kind of self-regulate themselves in kind of a distributed environment, because that's another big challenge that we're working on is, well, how do we create decentralized social organization models? Like Bitcoin's obviously in chaos, and when something falls under entropy, it allows a dictator to take shape. It allows somebody to come out and say, well, if you guys can't order yourselves, I'll order it. And that's kind of what we have with Blockstream. And I mean, I've seen some censorship there, and it's not been something I've been too happy about. And I see that, you know, I mean, Bitmain and Blockstream pretty much have control of the protocol, and segregated witness and all this Bitcoin fork drama. It's not good. So, I mean, we need people to see that. And I mean, if you believe that, if you feel that, if you feel what we're talking about, if you feel that passion too of saying like, I want to make the world better, I don't want to just pursue greed. I mean, granted, we need resources to do things, and money is a byproduct of that. Money, when you do valuable things for the world, you earn money. But if money is your foresight, you're going to always be chasing this carrot on a stick, and you're never going to really truly see the true value of things that we can do. So, I mean, sorry to be so loquacious, but I mean, I think we need people to just come together and see the positive. And if you want to get involved, just come into Slack. You know, just go to nexusearch.com/slack.html. I mean, if you're a coder, come in and check out the code, put in some pull requests. I mean, give us emails. Like if you have anything, I mean, that's kind of our philosophy is do what you feel you are good at. And if you don't know what you're good at or you don't know where you fit in, just talk to some people and they'll be like, hey, well, we're doing this or that. Oh, do you have any ideas? Oh, well, here, why don't you come work with me? And that's kind of the collaborative spirit, I guess, that we're working on cultivating more and more in the community.
That is amazing. Colin, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and chat with us today. I think this is, we've covered some really great information here, and anyone who's new to Nexus learned a lot. Anyone who's been with Nexus for a while learned a lot as well. So this has been awesome. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, man.
Thank you.